Good morning. It is what time? It is 9:10 a.m. on Sunday, September 3rd, 2017. This is the gesture I make when I have to look past the little wire that's blocking the clock in the bottom of my screen. I'm Christiana Ellis, and I just got up. This is 5 more minutes because it is Sunday. We are, of course, continuing our rewatch series of Avatar: The Last Airbender with Season 3, Episode 12, 13. Shoot. Had, uh, I'm going to have it in a second. Actually, I think it is 13, but it is The Boiling Rock, Part 1. And this is the first part, obviously, of a two-parter. You know, you can tell because of the part one there in the title. Um, I'm trying to pull up the synopsis because I read it on my iPad this morning. So, this, like many two-parters, does a lot of work in just setting up a situation instead of necessary. So it's being only part one. It's not necessarily going to have the same level of a satisfying, like a conclusion. There's no conclusion of an arc in this episode because it's obviously setting up for part two. Although that said, as a part one, I feel like it does a satisfying job of completing the arc that is establishing the new situation that will then need to be resolved. But the other thing is that as we, roar into the second half of the final season, we understand now that there's really not likely to be any filler episodes remaining. There's a one minor. um, there's an episode coming later this season that is an exception to that, and yet one that I don't think anyone begrudges because it's amazing. The Ember Island Players when we get to that, but as we establish in this episode, there's a lot of all the characters are playing high stakes games now, and there's never going to be a guarantee that things will ever return to, normal, right? And for that matter, I mean, the kids are trying to change normal, right? They're not trying to just return things to the way they used to be, because that's with the Fire Lord in charge, right? Like, they are trying to change the world. And so it's an interesting question when we say a two-parter, and I kind of imply that, like, oh, okay, we've established the new situation. Zuko and Sokka are stuck in this prison, and then the idea of like, oh, okay, well, surely we're not going to leave them stuck there, but what scenario are we actually returning to? So, we start the episode though with Zuko continuing to try to emulate his uncle, which is really kind of sweet and uh, charming, even though it's awkward for him because behaving this way is not something he's accustomed to. But the having Zuko attempt to serve the others tea and be the polite host, makes the tea, pours it and serves it for each of them, and then tries to tell the tea-based joke, uh, you know, leave me alone, I'm bushed, but he doesn't know the setup. And, once again, we see some, Katara especially being a little harder on him than might typically be ideal. We haven't seen her warm to him at all yet. Excuse me. Um, yeah, so in any case, though, at the same time, otherwise, Zuko still struggling to find his precise dynamic in the group, but having helped Aang with his firebending, everyone else seems to have accepted him more or less. welcoming him into the new status quo, even if he's still kind of awkward because he's not used to being just part of a team. But, he's working on it, which is nice to see. He's making an effort. But is in part of all of this, we see Sokka is clearly troubled by something. And Sokka eventually pulls Zuko aside and asks where prisoners would have been sent. And of course, we know that that's got to be on his mind. After the invasion, we had all of the remaining parts of the army, including Sokka and Katara's father, be taken prisoner. And that's got to be, hard to deal with. And so he wants to hear from Sokka, where do you think they would take prisoners? And Zuko, or excuse me, Zuko. Zuko is initially hesitant to tell, doing a little bit of a writing trick to try to build tension by like, oh, you don't really want to know, it's too bad. But like in real life, when would you ever, like, if you ask someone a question and they say, oh, you don't really want to know that, it's too awful? Like, there is no scenario where telling someone that means that they don't still want you to tell them. I mean, at the same time, as a bit of social grace in the sense of forewarning you, you're not going to like the answer, I suppose that's a fair thing to do. And so maybe I'm overreacting in terms of, do people really talk like that? I don't think they do, though. Like, I would say, people might say, are you really want to know? It's not good, that sort of thing. But I don't know. In any case, Zuko answers finally that the Boiling Rock, which is, of course, the episode title, is a prison that is on an island in a boiling lake in a volcano, which is kind of cool. Is where they have have these prisoners held, and there's some interesting elements of that. Definitely reminds us a little bit of the all metal earthbending prison from season 1. Excuse me, goodness. Sorry, I'm still kind of fighting off a little bit of a cold. But, honestly, we knew about the prisoners, and so that's something that, hearing about the prison doesn't sound like a fun place, but what's actually a little bit heartbreaking in this sequence is recognizing how personally Sokka is taking that situation as being his fault. Like, it was his plan. He was the one that made the decision that everyone would stay and keep trying to find the royal family. But at the same time, if we remember that episode, he does sort of hesitate to make that decision and is told by his father and some of the other people there who agree that if there's a chance, they want to try to stay. And so, to be fair, it is reasonable for Sokka, who was in the leadership position at that point, to take responsibility for making the decision, regardless of whether people are on board or not. But it's a little bit sad to realize that he thinks he needs to restore his honor by rescuing everybody. I mean, it's one thing to want to rescue them, of course. But the idea that he sees it as a personal failure rather than just an unpleasant situation to be repaired. And that's a little bit sad, you feel like, I think we as viewers don't feel like it's his fault. The problem ultimately was, of course, that the enemy learned about the plan. That's the problem. Is that they ended up telling someone who told someone else in a situation that allowed the Fire Nation to lay a trap here. And I mean, that's what went wrong. And even still, even though they didn't get what they wanted, and it led to, everyone being captured, like, that doesn't make the plan bad. So it's sad to realize that Sokka feels that way. But at the same time, I feel like it's very in character. We believe that he would feel that way. And it's interesting too that Sokka's kind of emotional response to this situation is feeling like I put so much thought into that plan and it all went wrong, and feeling kind of exacerbating that feeling by saying, well, all of my plans, when I put a lot of time and thought into them, go wrong, so I'm going to try just winging it. We can't help but think, it's like, well, that's not really how it works. But at the same time, I mean, there can be something to be said for going with your gut instead of overthinking things. But at the same time, I think Zuko rightly points out, oh, you're just going to just fly there on Appa with no other plan at all by yourself? That doesn't seem like a good plan. And so, even though initially Sokka promises Zuko that he's not planning anything, Zuko sees through that lie and says, he's going to come too. And they'll use the war balloon rather than take Appa. And so it's interesting. It's I think, at this point in the episode, we're already in a place of being excited to have Zuko and Sokka spend some time together. I mean, that's a combination we haven't seen much of, and to kind of establish the dynamic, we need to have Zuko, kind of have this connection and establish the chemistry with each of the other members of this group. And so we have them traveling on the war balloon, and there's some fun, awkward conversation where, they're kind of connecting, but it's also a little bit, playing a little bit with that, the boys don't like to make small talk idea, but also just not really having it be a joke about that so much as a reality that these two guys recognize sort of a connection with each other in the sense of they're having a shared purpose, but they also don't know each other well, and so it is a little awkward. And the fact that what history they do have was fraught. The small talk is not necessarily going to be easy, but they're making an effort, which is kind of fun. And so they talk about the fluffy clouds, and then eventually the talk turns to girls, and Zuko muses about having had to leave Mai behind, which it's actually some nice writing here because it feels very natural to have it come up in the dialogue here, but it also functions as a reminder of that situation because it'll come up later with the prison warden. And so it's some good writing there. I like when shows or movies are able to do that effectively, to have a bit of dialogue feel very natural and important and revealing in one scene, but have it also be laying the groundwork for a surprise later. I like that when it works. It's hard to do well, I think. But in any event, we get one of the best exchanges, I think, in the whole series, which is that listening to Zuko be sad about Mai, Sokka just says, "My last girlfriend turned into the moon," and Zuko says, "That's rough, buddy." That's fantastic. I just love that exchange so much. It's so, because of course, obviously we know that is kind of what happened, right? With Princess Yue back in the finale of season 1. But to have Sokka say what on the, superficially seems like such a crazy, ridiculous, absurd thing, and to have Zuko respond in such sort of a like an ordinary fashion, that's rough, buddy, and mean it, like it's not even a joke, right? It's just like, yeah. But what do you say to something like that when someone is obviously kind of sadly reminiscing, "My first girlfriend turned into the moon"? You know what you say? You say, "That's rough, buddy." Anyway, I love that. But so they make their way to the prison, and I think it's actually a really clever bit of world building and storytelling that as they descend into the very steamy, hot air coming up out of this uh, boiling lake, they realize that their hot air balloon is less effective when the air outside the balloon is very warm. And they suddenly are forced into a crash landing. I thought that that was really kind of clever. It did make me wonder a little bit about the physics, just in the sense of how hot would the air outside the balloon have to be to cause that? And is that something that you could really, like manage? Could you have a person be there? But at the same time, I suppose the air doesn't have to be like literally full steam necessarily, which person could almost certainly not survive, um, to in order to make the balloon less efficient. Because of course, if you think about a balloon, a hot air balloon, maintaining constant altitude, that would mean that the buoyancy of the air in the balloon is just matched by the weight of the balloon. And so if you reduce the buoyancy even just a little bit, it would cause you to lose altitude. And usually that would be, corrected by increasing the air temperature in the balloon with your little fire. But if you're not able to keep up, then there you go. So I thought that was actually really clever and tied in neatly to, the idea of this cool prison place. It's also a fun callback, just in the sense that they're literally dropping into a volcano when I think Sokka had said something joking in a previous episode about, like, I'd rather jump into a volcano. I'm trying to remember what it was that exactly he said, but there's a lot of fun stuff there. So in any case, they sink the balloon and the little ship because they don't want it to be found, which is reasonable in one sense, but they're also recognizing here that, like, oh, well, we don't actually have a way out now, so that's not great. We'll have to figure something out. They have a relatively easy time sneaking in and stealing uniforms, guard uniforms. The show, I think, kind of just hand waves their ability to do that because we're trying to tell a story in half an hour here. But when they are able to make their way in and pose as guards, that gets us into the story. So the goal here is to try to gain intelligence about where are the prisoners, is Sokka's father here, who else is here, and maybe look for what might be a way to get out. So we are in a position where we have to establish the dynamic of this prison, right? And one of the ways that they choose to do that is by introducing this prisoner, I believe I want to say Chit Sang. Yes, Chit Sang is a big, beefy, tough guy prisoner, and we set up sort of a classic prison movie abuse of power dynamic where one of the guards is berating him for, you didn't bow when I walked by. And the prisoner is like, that's not a real rule. But it's obvious that the guard is just trying to humiliate him as a personal power trip. And we see what is one of the classic techniques of abuse of power, which happens all too often in the real world, which is the guard knows that he probably can't actually punish this prisoner in the way he wants to for disobeying a made-up rule. But what he can do is press his authoritarian privilege of being the guard. He can, force the prisoner into using firebending to defend himself, and then that's against the rules, and now he can be punished. So he forces the situation, pushes the guard, tries to essentially just humiliate him, rob him of his dignity until the point where attempting to prevent the loss of his dignity forces him to break a rule, and then punishing him. And there's a number of ways that there's some deft storytelling there, because for one, it introduces this guy, this prisoner. It establishes that this is a prison where there's abuse of power taking place. And then when Sokka is forced to, let's see, was it actually Sokka or was it Zuko? Yeah, it is Sokka. So the guard says, Sokka, you help me put him in the cooler. And that introduces the idea of the cooler, which is this small area that is kept super cold as a punishment for firebending. Which, like, there's some fun ideas in there. And I mean, the engineer in me wonders a little bit, like, is it really practical to... Because I'm sure it would take a fair amount of energy to make an area that cold when you have so much heat ambient coming in. I don't know. That seems kind of impractical, especially if you're using it only as a punishment for this sort of thing. But whatever, at the same time, there's certainly examples in the real world of worse things. For all we know, it could have been a practice that evolved just from, they have coolers to make, say, guard quarters comfortable. And there are certain little pockets in the engineering space that are even colder as a part of that, that effort. And then they said, hey, what if we put a prisoner in there? And then so on and so forth. But it's fun that seeing the cooler and the device and the mechanisms used to make it, Sokka's engineering mind immediately says, okay, well, this cell, in order to stay that cold, would have to be insulated. And it would be so insulated that perhaps if it were submerged in a boiling lake, the inside would still be somewhat comfortable and survivable as a boat to sail across a boiling lake. And so that's he's immediately thinking, hey, that's a potential escape attempt, which is great. In the meantime, though, Zuko has been asking around, and there's also some more fun awkwardness of seeing Zuko try to discover who he is now that he's trying to let go of this sort of bratty, privileged, moody teenager that he had been as Prince Zuko. It's been fun watching him try to navigate normal human interaction now that he's letting that persona go. And obviously he doesn't want to take the helmet off, so just some of the exchanges of like, why are you wearing your helmet in the lounge at lunch? And he's just like, if I'm unprepared, someone could strike me on the head, and everyone's laughing. But he discovers to both his and Sokka's dismay that it seems that at least at present there are no waterbending prisoners, which just means that although certainly there are prisoners here, there's not Sokka's father, who is the specific prisoner Sokka was most hoping to rescue. And yet, he does discover someone we haven't seen in a long time. Suki! Yay, Suki of the Kyoshi Warriors is here. And we remember that that Azula told Sokka, baiting him and trying to stall him, is like, she's been in prison so long, she gave up on you. And so it's nice to see that when, Sokka spots her in the yard, and then he goes and we have a scene a little bit reminiscent of Star Wars there, and when he comes in form of the guard, and he's trying to be all clever in terms of like, oh, well, maybe you remember this, and he goes in for a kiss, and then she wallops him, which is pretty funny. But then, of course, recognizes him and is very happy to see him. She hadn't given up on him at all. And it's great to see that she's okay. We don't really get a sense of like her other Kyoshi warriors, but we hadn't really established them as definitive characters. So it's Suki that we're excited to see. And so now, even if they can't rescue Sokka's father, maybe they can at least rescue Suki. So they have to start working out a plan. Um, in the process, though, of him talking with Suki, Zuko's cover gets blown, and he sort of lets himself be captured in order to not implicate Sokka as well, and so that's not ideal. But they have to, they're in a dangerous situation. They have to try to not get all of them compromised. And so this is where we get the payoff of reminding everyone about May, because apparently May's uncle is the warden of this prison and recognizes Zuko. It's a little bit weird that they imply that he only recognizes Zuko because of, oh yeah, you broke my niece's heart. But at the same time, we're like, he also has a really distinctive scar. um, And so it seems plausible that he would recognize him anyway. And however, yet making it a personal thing and also using that personal thing to bring up Zuko's own mindset about it, namely that there were, he did have to leave everything behind. And the idea of, was it hard to leave everything behind? And he kind of says, no, it really wasn't, which is kind of nice. And I'm sure it's kind of refreshing for him. It was easy to leave his father and his sister behind because he had recognized that they were really not good for him anyway. But leaving May behind was harder. And especially having to do it the way he did because he didn't want her to be implicated in his treachery. And so, yeah, that's it's nice to layer that emotional element into this whole thing, as well as to have the warden have this personal grudge against Zuko. Basically saying, we're going to hold you here until we can get word out and report you and turn you in for the reward. So that now puts a clock on everybody's escape attempt, right? We get more great awkward small talk between Zuko and now Suki, where she's like, oh, I remember you. You burned down my village. And he's like, oh, well, it's good to see you. Because again, it's like, well, what do you say? I mean, I'm sorry. But, so, they come up with a plan, though. And the plan is complicated when Chit Sang, the prisoner we met earlier, overhears them, and now he wants to be in on this plan too, but okay, I guess we're forced to now. But so the plan, namely to fake a fight, have Zuko firebend, get put in the cooler, but then he uses the breath of fire technique to maintain his personal warmth in the water. I'm trying to remember when. What episode that was that he learned that. Let's see. I feel like I'm not as prepared this morning. Yeah, so let's see. Zuko used his breath of fire technique to keep warm, I'm looking at a trivia page for the Avatar Wikia, like he did in the Siege of the North Part 2, which is the Season 1 finale. So that's an ability he has, and he is able to use that to also be in there with, he snuck some tools in to disassemble the cell and allow everyone to take it apart later. And I mean, there's a little bit more hand-waviness in terms of like, well, okay, would he really have been able to take that apart from the inside? And then how did they get it? But blah, blah. Who cares? But while they're implementing their plan, they overhear that some new war prisoners are coming. So, just as they're readying their escape, Sokka reveals that he's going to stay just in case one of these new prisoners might be his dad. And then Sokka and Suki both agree to stay with him, and then Chit Sang, who had also brought 2 more of his buddies to escape with him, decides, all right, well, we're escaping, so they head out. And it's actually pretty interesting in the sense that, well, or I don't know, interesting is not the right word, but it enriches the story and gets us ramped up for part 2, both in learning that the plan, while it was mostly working when it's being run only by the impulsive tough guy prisoner, he ends up burning himself, crying out, and then getting them all caught, which probably means a couple of things. One is that those prisoners might still be around, and 2, the guards are likely to be wise to this plan now. But also then it turns out one of these prisoners is Sokka's father, Hakoda. So we're all set up now for part 2, where we have a couple of things happening. Obviously, Katara and Aang and Toph and all the rest of the kids are going to eventually wonder, where did they go? They said they were fishing, but they've been gone a long time. And then also we have Sokka and Zuko and Suki all in the in this prison still, with the clock ticking for Zuko, and it's a little tricky. What are they going to do? And now they have Hakoda and potentially other prisoners to try to escape. Their one escape attempt is probably not going to work anymore. So, what's the plan, right? And so we will find out in next week's episode, The Boiling Rock, Part 2. Some of the other trivia stuff that they've got on this Wikia mentions that this is the second episode in which Aang appeared but used no bending. The first being the Puppet Master. And so we do remember all we saw from Aang really in this episode was him groaning about Zuko's note telling him to do hot squats every time he hears a badger frog croak. But hot squats are apparently just like knee bends. So in any case, yeah. The cooler, incidentally, it's worth noting, I guess I maybe didn't say anything because it seemed obvious in my head, is that the cooler is kind of a classic name for, they always call it like the box or something like that, the hole. What is the solitary confinement punishment in these types of places? Let's see. When Zuko discovers that Sokka is about to leave on Appa, there's a subtle role reversal. Zuko says that he is never happy, a line which strongly echoes one of Katara's in The Waterbending Master in regards to Sokka never being happy. And moments later, Sokka says he has to regain his honor, which is, of course, something that was Zuko's whole thing. That's an interesting observation. I don't know. I'm not just going to read these trivia things, but yeah. So as this is a part 1, like I said, it feels unresolved at the end, but that's just because we're setting up for part 2, and we're racing towards the end of the series at this point. So. I believe there's 7 more episodes now total. So we'll continue, and I'll see you next Sunday for more Avatar: The Last Airbender, and I'll talk to you tomorrow for 5 more minutes.